Slavery in the United States was not just a labor system, it was an economic structure designed to extract wealth from African labor while systematically preventing enslaved people from accumulating any kind of wealth. Enslaved Africans were property and in most cases could not own their own property or inherit wealth or pass down assets to future generations. Even those who gained freedom in the colonial or antebellum era faced structural restrictions. Laws often limited their right to testify in court, own land in certain regions, or enter professions. Without access to education, credit, or protection under property law, free Black people had almost no avenues for upward mobility in a society organized around their exclusion. After the Civil War, Reconstruction briefly opened new possibilities. The Freedmen's Bureau supported education. Some Black families acquired land, and Black men voted and held office in the South. These gains translated into modest improvements in literacy, wages, and political power. However, these changes were fragile. Federal withdrawal in 1877 allowed Southern states to impose Jim Crow segregation, which enforced racial hierarchies through law, violence, and economic control. Black families were pushed into sharecropping, a system that trapped them in cycles of debt, while access to credit and fair wages was systematically denied. Lynching and terror campaigns further destroyed wealth and drove African Americans off valuable land. Hi, you're in class with Dr. T. The civil rights movement dismantled legal segregation and won major legislative victories, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yet, dismantling de jure discrimination did not undo centuries of wealth deprivation. Housing policies like redlining, which was formally outlawed only in 1968, had already concentrated Black families in undervalued neighborhoods and excluded them from federally backed mortgages that helped white families build intergenerational wealth. People ask, how is racism structural? Well, this is structural, right? The law excluded Black people from federally backed mortgages, but helped white families build intergenerational wealth, right? Because they didn't face those exclusions. Employment discrimination, which has been well documented. School segregation and unequal access to credit continued in subtler but powerful forms. Even after civil rights reforms, African Americans continued to face structural disadvantages in wealth accumulation. There was housing inequality. While home ownership is the largest source of wealth for American families, Black households are less likely to own homes and are more vulnerable to predatory lending and foreclosure, as was seen in the 2008 financial crisis. Business ownership, that is, access to startup capital and credit, remains unequal, limiting Black entrepreneurship. Education and debt. Black students are more likely to take on high student loan debt, diminishing wealth gains from higher education. Labor market discrimination. Yes, wage gaps persist even when controlling for education and experience. Right? So Black African Americans face wage gaps even when they have the same education and they have the same experience. This has been documented with several studies. This obviously limits Black households' ability to save and invest. According to the Federal Reserve's survey of consumer finances that racial wealth gap widened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Median black wealth rose from $27,970 in 2019 to $44,890 in 2022. Median white wealth, however, rose far higher to $285,000, leaving a gap of $240,120. For every $100 in white household wealth, black households held about $15, and this is in 2022. Latino households had a median of $62,000, and Asian American households reported for 2022 had $536,000. Although wealth increased across the board, the structure of wealth accumulation remained unequal. Black households saw modest gains in home equity, but lacked the business and financial equity that drove exponential growth for whites and Asian households, right? So since the first survey of consumer finances in 1983, the black-white wealth gap has averaged $172,000 and has never closed significantly. Slavery wasn't just about forced labor. It was an entire economic system built to extract wealth from African labor while denying African people the ability to accumulate any kind of wealth. Enslaved people were legally barred from owning property, passing down wealth, or gaining education. Even those who managed to become free faced discriminatory laws that kept them from acquiring land or accessing credit. In short, slavery didn't just steal labor, it cut off entire generations of African Americans from building the foundations of wealth, land, business, savings that white Americans were free to accumulate, right? After the Civil War, Reconstruction gave a glimpse of what could have been. Black men voted, held office, gained literacy, and in some cases bought land. But those gains were short-lived. When federal troops left the South in 1877, Jim Crow laws took hold. Black farmers were pushed into sharecropping, a system of endless debt, violence, lynching, and white terror organizations drove African Americans off land that they had purchased, right? So this brief moment of mobility was taken away from African Americans during the Jim Crow era. And new discriminatory laws kept them locked into second-class status. In effect, black economic mobility was cut short right when it had just begun. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s broke down legal segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed much of Jim Crow. But winning rights on paper didn't undo centuries of economic exclusion. Housing is a perfect example. White families have been building wealth for decades through federally backed mortgages, while black families were locked out by something called redlining. There were maps drawn by banks and the federal government, right? So this is structural. In other words, the federal government labeled black neighborhoods as high risk, and the federal government denied them loans. When those rules were finally outlawed in 1968, guess what? The damage had already been done. White families had accumulated property, wealth, while black families had been systematically excluded. Black ghettos in the North, Midwest, and Western cities existed long before the Civil Rights Movement. During the Great Migration, African Americans who fled the South in search of better jobs and safety found themselves funneled into segregated neighborhoods through restrictive covenants, right? In other words, they could not live where they want. They were forced into very specific neighborhoods. This is not just the South, this is the North where these ghettos arise. This is the Midwest where these ghettos arise. This is the West where these ghettos arise. These communities were often overcrowded. They were underfunded, but they were also became centers of Black culture, business, and political activism. So African Americans, no, they weren't just victims, but there were structural laws preventing them from gaining full civil rights, even though, despite that, they started their own businesses and were innovators in creating American culture as we know it and fought politically for civil rights. After the civil rights, however, a new dynamic emerged. Even though legal segregation was dismantled, there still existed blockbusting and white flight accelerated. Real estate agents deliberately stoked white fear of integration to drive down property values, while banks continued to deny loans in Black neighborhoods. As white families fled to the suburbs, Black middle-class families were blocked from moving into those new communities. Or if they did, the presence of Black neighbors was used to justify lowering home values. The result wasn't just the persistence of ghettos, but their expansion. They expanded. That's right. After the civil rights era, the so-called ghetto in many ways expanded and got worse. Black neighborhoods were locked out of appreciating property values. Tax bases eroded, right? Because many middle-class Blacks now left the so-called ghetto. So the tax bases eroded. So there were less resources for those in those communities. And many cities use so-called urban renewal projects to bulldoze Blacks' homes for highways and commercial centers. In other words, even when African Americans had the income to integrate, structural racism in housing markets prevented them from translating that into wealth. Even as segregation became illegal, structural inequality persisted. Housing discrimination limited Black home ownership and wealth accumulation. Predatory lending, especially as we saw in the 2008 financial crisis, was still stripping away Black wealth through foreclosures. Education came with crushing debt as Black students still disproportionately rely on loans for their education. Labor market discrimination still exists. That means wage gaps remain, even with equal education, right? So often Blacks and whites who have equal education and the same experience still do not have the same wages. These barriers mean that even as the economy grew, Black families were denied the ability to build intergenerational wealth at the same rate as white families. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances showed just how stark this remains. Between 2019 and 2022, the median Black wealth rose from $27,970 to $44,890. This is worth repeating, right? But white median wealth soared to $285,000. That left a gap of $240,120, right? So for every $100 white families have, again, Black families had $15. But here's the key. These numbers don't tell the full story. Because you know what? There's enormous inequality even within each racial group, right? So a wealthy Black elite exists. There are black elites who have a lot of money, but the majority of black families remain far below the national average, right? But guess what? This also exists in all communities. For example, in the Asian households, although they have the highest median wealth, but they also have some of the deepest internal inequality. It's easy to fall into the stereotype about Asian wealth, but the real explanation lies in immigration policy, right? So this is even structural. This is also structural. So in the Asian case, you have the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, sometimes called the Hart-Celler Act, ending racist quotas, and it opened the door for new Asian immigration. Many who came in the late 20th century were highly educated, though, right? They were directly recruited into tech, medicine, and engineering fields, high-paying professions. This selective immigration meant certain Asian groups entered the U.S. already with college degrees, which translated into higher incomes and the ability to have wealth accumulation. Also, several studies have shown that white Americans prefer Asians over, for example, African Americans or Latinos living beside them. But that's not the whole story. Other Asian groups like the Hmong, the Cambodian, the Laotian, and the Vietnamese refugees who arrived after the Vietnam War often came with little education and trauma from war and displacement. They were resettled in poor neighborhoods with limited resources. And guess what? Today, the Hmong and Cambodian Americans face some of the highest poverty rates in the country. So while the median wealth for Asian Americans looks high, it hides deep inequality. The gap between, say, Indian or Taiwanese professionals and Southeast Asian refugees is enormous. That inequality reflects differences in immigration pathways and educational opportunities. So there's not just a single Asian culture. And it's not just Asians. Every racial group has vast internal inequality among white Americans. The top 10% hold most of the wealth, while millions of working class whites struggle with stagnant wages. Among Black and Latino families, a small professional elite has built wealth, but most remain far below the national average. The lesson is clear. Race and class intersect. Racial barriers matter, but so does an unequal distribution of wealth within racial groups. From slavery to Jim Crow to redlining and blockbusting, the story is consistent. Black Americans were systematically denied the chance to accumulate wealth, even after the civil rights movement. Structural barriers continued. The COVID-19 pandemic showed that even when wealth rises overall, racial gaps persist or even widen. Asian American wealth reminds us that immigration policies, education, and opportunities shape outcomes, not innate cultural traits. And inequality within all groups remind us that we can't just compare groups against each other. If we want to close the racial wealth gap, we need structural solutions. Don't be afraid of that word, structural solutions. Affordable housing, student debt relief, fair lending policies, stronger labor protections, and some kind of reparations for centuries of stolen wealth. Because the truth is, wealth inequality in America isn't an accident. It's a system, and only systematically Only through systematic change can we undo it. Does this mean we have to overthrow capitalism and create some socialist society? No, we don't have to do that. We can still have winners and losers, quote unquote, but we have to figure out a system that works. This was done under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but it was incomplete, the project. And the attempts to improve the system under LBJ was also incomplete. LBJ being Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was president of the United States from 63 to 68. So we need to figure this out. If you find this breakdown helpful, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. And I want to hear from you. Do you think solutions to the racial wealth gap should focus more on race or class or both? How do you think immigration policies have shaped wealth inequality, not just for Asians, but for Latinos, Africans, and Caribbean migrants as well? And what role should the government play? Do we need reparations or just stronger safety nets or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading and responding. Thank you.